Sometimes we think of an abuser as someone who sneaks up in a back alley in the middle of the night, but that's not always the case. 90% of children are abused by someone they know and trust. We let our guard down at home, at school, and even in the church. In this program, we delve into the story of one family's anguish, and we hear from experts on how we can best protect the precious gifts God has entrusted in our care. Viewer discretion is advised. Welcome, Lynn. Thank you so much for joining us. So, Lynn Stone, mother of 11 children.
Yes.
Tell us about yourself and your family.
So me and my husband have 11 children together, and my oldest is 25, and my youngest is 4. And we've homeschooled them all the way through so far, and really enjoy it. We just have enjoyed having all of our children with us and hanging out and doing some fun stuff through family, and that's really been our hobby per se.
So you've been busy, a very busy mother. All right. So I want to start with the event that your local church had. And so there were booths that were set up, and I think this is such a neat idea for a church to do, whereby they invite the community to come in and talk about the resources that are available. And so there were some pamphlets that were put out by one of these community groups. Walk us through what happened after that.
Sure. So our church was holding an event, and all the local resources came in. Our excitement was to get people involved in volunteering and just learn about what's out there in the community for us. And I set up one of the tables I helped with, and it was for a local Children's Advocacy Center, the CAC, and they are an intake where they deal with prevention and education, as well as if your child is sexually abused or if there's an allegation, they would come there. And in-house, they actually take care of forensic interviews, they take care of any medicals that need to be done. You meet with detectives and prosecutors. They do their therapy right there. It's just an amazing resource that almost every community has across the United States.
So that information caught your eye, and you decided to go home. What happened next?
So the pamphlets, they explained easily to children about their body parts and about what a safe touch would be versus a bad touch, an unsafe touch. And they had coloring things, all kinds of fun things for the kids to do, to learn about. So we sat down with our children and thought we'd have a little time of education with them. And we expected to hear absolutely nothing. And in the midst of our conversation, one of my young children raised their hand and said that they knew what a bad touch was and they had experienced it. And it was absolutely just caught us off guard.
What were you thinking at that point?
I was thinking that she was so young, she was confused, that maybe it was an accident. I couldn't believe or wrap my mind around that one of our children we've kept so safe and safeguarded them as far as not spending the night places or riding the bus or different things we had just put in place to keep our family so safe. How could that have happened?
So decided to move forward, and then July 4th, 2020, what happened?
So we decided to move forward on the basis that maybe this was a dream or something that she had kind of come up with that didn't happen. So we moved forward on the basis that we were going to keep her safe, but yet we were going to continue to see the family member. We didn't believe that was possible for that to happen. So we moved forward, and July 4th, we had a pretty normal family gathering. We would get together and have swimming and eat and stuff together. So I had stayed home. We had a sick baby, so I stayed home with the baby, and my husband went off with the children to a pool party with our family members.
What happened?
At that party, there was a couple of my children that were abused right in the center of everything. It wasn't off in a secret room. It wasn't, in the dark somewhere. It was right in plain sight. And my husband never saw anything, never thought anything, never heard anything. I mean, we weren't looking for that, right? We weren't expecting. And so they came home. We had the sick baby, so we were dealing with some things. And a couple days later, they were putting their bathing suits back on. And that was the triggering moment for them to say, I should tell Mom what had happened when I was wearing that bathing suit the last time.
Okay. And so they came forward and explained to you that a relative had touched them inappropriately.
Yes.
What happened next?
It was a fury of things. I knew, okay, this is the second time, and it was the same individual that was named before. So we knew we needed to get into action. So I called my husband, and he wanted to meet with his dad, who was a police officer. He was a detective. He knew that kind of thing. So we met with them first and told them about the allegations of what our daughter was saying, and they at first, cried and were sympathetic. But then, as the wife came over, they, began to feel sorry for her, and then he eventually came, the abuser came, and we confronted him, and he cried and, said that it wasn't possible, it wasn't true. And so the room did shift to where they began to think, well, maybe it's, similar to how we felt in the beginning. Maybe it's not possible, that type of thing. And so we felt abandoned at that moment. We knew something had happened. This was the second time we had heard. Unfortunately, it took us that long to figure it out. And so we moved forward, and we did contact the police, and the local police department took over the case, and it was really out of our hands at that point.
Okay. And so there are lots and twists and turns with this story, which folks can read in the Herald, all the details, from your family pretty much shunning you.
Yep.
And you have to go into hiding, going through the trial. But this case has a successful ending. And from what I understand, this is not the norm. This is like 1 to 3% of cases that result in a successful conviction.
Yeah, so when people report, so the reported abuse allegations that come in, so often there's not enough things for the prosecutor to believe that he can present this to a jury of 12 people that often don't know a lot about sexual abuse and prove it beyond the reasonable doubt. They have that aspect of it. So that weighs heavy upon them. And so it's not that they don't believe that the abuse happened, it's just there's often no witnesses. It's often done in private. Nobody actually sees the act. There's often no DNA or things that they can collect and prove as well. So it's often a one-on-one situation, his word versus theirs. And so those cases are very heavy and very hard to bring to trial. So for our case, we were extremely successful, and we are so thankful. But I think there was a multitude of reasons. I think that our girls were super strong. They were able to confront their abuser. I mean, when you're in trial, you point out your abuser and you say, that man right there, and then you explain what he did to you. And so by a miracle, our girls were able to do that on stand in front of a jury. So that's number one. And then I also think that we had, amazing detectives that they knew what they were up against with a sexual abuse case. So he did great work. And also the prosecutor. They have to know and expect what things are going to be coming up in court, and they have to be willing to make that risk. And in our case, he was. And we're so thankful for the prosecutor and the work that he was able to do on our case.
Serving 25 years behind bars.
Yeah.
How are the girls doing?
They're doing well. We have seasons where there's, memories, like we just celebrated July 4th. That's obviously hard. But overall, we feel like they've done so well. They were able to stand up against him. They were able to share what had happened, and they were able to see justice, which is amazing. That's one of the things we were actually afraid of, was them going to court and through that process. People had told us, oh, that could make them worse, or cause more trauma. And I believe it gave them power and strength. And, they were able to feel safe again. And they'll still ask, where are we at? And, where is he at? And he's safely tucked away. So I think that helps them to feel secure.
So this was a relative. How was he related to the family?
So he was my husband's brother-in-law. So he was married to my husband's sister. And the entire family really chose to take his side and support him, and we chose to support our girls and to fight for them and to be a voice for them.
You are still fighting for them. This is something whereby it is such a personal story. This is one of those stories whereby for some people they want to, tuck it away in a deep place where no one ever knows what happened. But you've chosen a different path. Why are you telling your story?
I believe that with education and the knowledge I have now, that we could have prevented what happened. And I don't want any other child to have to suffer, knowing that I could be out there teaching prevention skills, education to so many people, so that other children don't need to suffer this way. I do believe in prevention and that it can stop abuse. And so I actually read through my story before coming here today, and I say in there a line that I still believe today, that I am not going to be silent. I'm going to continue to be a voice for all kids so that we can stop this. I believe it's possible.
What are some of the things you're doing? Because you're very involved.
Yes. So we started a local group called Be a Voice, and we are passionate about our community and just putting out there events and education to help them realize what's going on in our own communities, in the homes. Statistically, it's 1 in 3 children, 1 in 3 girls, 1 in 5 boys. So that's a big number to handle, right? And so we want to bring to the community that kind of attention. Everyone thinks that's not going to happen in my family. It might happen, in someone else's, but not ours. Okay, well, even if it happens in your neighbors or your nieces or whoever's family, being educated is the key to this. And so if you could pick up on those signs, the grooming behaviors, all the different things, you could make a difference in a child's life. So we have done a couple events, a couple large events anyways. We did one at the Capitol at Lansing. Actually, it was in correlation to Blue Sabbath or Blue Sunday. That's in April, and that's the last weekend of the month. And April is Sexual Abuse Awareness Month. And so we went to the Capitol. We wanted to bring it right to the steps of the Capitol and say how important this topic is. And so we marched around for 42 minutes, and that was a tribute. And there's 42 million survivors in the United States of sexual abuse, 42 million. So we wanted that number known, we wanted that number out there, and we wanted to make a difference. So that was just a moving, great event that survivors could be part of. We had just all kinds of people that showed up and supported that event. Just recently, with the movie Sound of Freedom that just came out, putting the spotlight on child trafficking, sex trafficking, we had held an event at the movie theater. We rented out a free movie, an entire theater, and so we had about 200 people show up, and they were able to view the movie. And then after the movie, we had a Q&A where they could ask all the questions. They could find out locally what's happening here, how are people fighting that in our community, how are they helping girls that are rescued, what's happening in the community. So almost everyone attended the Q&A, which tells me people want to know more. That movie was super impactful. And then you leave there, what can I do? So they were able to leave, come out of the theater, and there we had booths set up. They could buy things from women that were trafficked, children that were trafficked, that they make items that are able to sell so that they can sustain themselves. We had tables of people that fought this, law enforcement. We had counselors people could talk to make a safe space for people to talk about these heavy topics. And then we had a local artist who drew just amazing original chalks of trafficked. And then we also had a Darkness to Light table, which is, I'm a facilitator of Darkness to Light training, which is a nationwide training that we've trained over 2 million people. And so they could then learn, how can I learn the signs? How can I know what's happening at my neighbors, what's happening in our workplace, nurses, teachers. There's so many signs that are going around us, and if we were educated and we could look, we could see and notice the children that are suffering right near us.
Wow. And so this all started with the event at your local church having those pamphlets available for you to go home.
Absolutely.
I want to close up by asking, what can our churches do for those who might be watching? What steps can they take to help?
Great question. One thing that I think is so important for our churches is to make sure our churches alone, the building is safe, right? We come in, inspect, see where the quiet corners are, the staircases, the dark areas, make sure that the doors are locked at the right times where they shouldn't be, so there's no areas of that. The other thing is policies. What policies do we have in place that is keeping the children safe in the church? Are predators allowed in? The easy predators are the ones that they've been convicted. They've actually had that. They went through the justice system and they're on the sex offender list. Those are the easy ones to spot. Usually the ones that have not been convicted yet, they're unknown, and so we need to then have safeguards in our churches and eyes, people just looking, people that are trained to know what they're looking for to keep our kids safe during church, during Sabbath school, during events. Events are huge because everyone's running around doing something different than normal, right? Normally we have these things in place, but what's happening outside of those? So there's so many things our church can do, and just become more educated. Never stop learning because it's changing. We have so much online things that are happening now and keeping our kids safe that way. So I just beg churches to continue to learn and to train your members and to train your leaders on what signs to look for and how to keep our kids safe.
Thank you. As we go along with this program, we're going to talk about more about what our churches can do, but thank you so much for sharing your story, and thank you so much for caring for others, outside of your family in terms of pouring into other communities in terms of how we can help. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
So the conversation continues, and I'm joined with Dr. Melissa Ponce-Rodas, who is with the School of Social and Behavioral Science here at Andrews University, Dr. David Sedlacek, who is a retired professor, congratulations, at the seminary here at Andrews University, and Dr. Beverly Sedlacek, who is a psychiatric nurse with a thriving counseling practice here in Berrien Springs. So thank you so much, each of you, for joining us. And so we'll start with you, Melissa. We heard Lynn's story, and we're hearing, unfortunately, more and more of these stories. Has our church learned a lesson? What are we knowing from all of these incidents?
So I think as a violence researcher, I admire the bravery of our church members who are coming forth and telling their stories. I mean, we heard Lynn say it's not just about her family, but she wants to educate others so that we can prevent this, so that we can stop this, so that we can help others. And I think that that's been happening in pockets around our global church community, and those survivors, those allies are the ones really that are bringing the church to a point that we have to decide, will we listen and what will we do?
Okay, so in your article in the August issue of the Herald, you gave some pointers. We're wanting to educate, we want to equip our members on how to safeguard our children. So what are some of those signs that we should be looking for?
To piggyback a bit off of Lynn, I think education is a great starting place, from the event they had for their local church community to the brochures that she got from the Children's Advocacy Center. I teach human sexuality here at Andrews, and I have students who still can't say body parts like vagina or penis. And we know that science tells us one of the best ways to prevent is to know the names. Just a basic starting point. And so I think we have that opportunity to start, and once we have that education, we can then continue with more steps.
With those. And so, we hear things like grooming, what is that?
So there's a myth, I think, that emerged when we started to learn about sexual violence, that it's this thing that happens once in a dark alley by someone you don't know. And actually, the majority of violence doesn't happen that way. It's usually by someone who you do know. And there's been time and preparation put into getting to bigger events. And so grooming is that process, that kind of desensitizing of the person, of the child, because it happens to any and all ages, both sexes as well. And that grooming process can start. I remember hearing one survivor story who said that there was a physician that was near her and noticed her body was going through pubertal changes and said, "Oh, I just want to make sure your body is progressing as it should." But there were so many conversations that led up to then the physical abuse. So that grooming, emotional abuse, verbal boundaries being crossed, to then the physical, the sexual violence.
Okay, so I want to go to Dr. Bev, because this is not something that is abstract. You actually, in your article, talk about sexual abuse that you had to go through at an early age. Help us understand what it is that the trauma that those who have been abused go through.
Yes. For me, my abuse happened when approximately I was about 3 or 4, and it was at the hands of an uncle. And we were playing a game. I'm reminded of, again, what happened with Lynn and the desensitization, as you just mentioned, Melissa, that, this is just a game. And I don't remember details. I just remember I always knew what a male penis looked like. And my memory did not resurface until I was in my mid-20s. And that's a pretty common phenomenon as well, that memories get buried because it's too much. And mine didn't resurface until I was in my mid-20s. However, I do understand today that having that experience at 3 or 4 set me up along with the family dynamics, to set me up when a young boy paid attention to me, and I really longed for male attention when he suggested there's a chance in a million you can get pregnant the first time you have sex. I thought those are great odds, and when I did indeed get pregnant at 13, I now understand that there was a connection back from the time I was violated at age 3.
As it turns out, your story, which we can read more in the article, but you came to the church, and that was the place where you found healing. Tell us about that.
Yes. So for me, back in the day, they kicked you out of school. I'm a poster child for being sanguine. I loved school, and so when the news broke that I was pregnant, I got kicked out of school, and so I was at home someone sent me Voice of Prophecy lessons. And I always knew Saturday was the Sabbath, and I couldn't wait. I didn't go out of the house. I stayed in the house. I had a couple of friends who told me that their parents forbade them playing with me because I was a bad girl. And so I stayed in the house carrying a lot of shame. And when I got these Voice of Prophecy lessons, I would get them in the mail one day and out they would go the next day, because I was just so hungry for understanding Scripture. And then when I got the lesson on the Sabbath, I knew I wanted to be a part of a church that kept the Sabbath. And so the Voice of Prophecy graders connected me with the church. And I got to this church. Eric is 6 weeks old, and I walk in this church and they have a plethora of young people. The church is just bubbling over. And none of the young people believed that this was my child. Again, I was a young 14, young looking 14, and here I am with this baby. But I got connected with older members in the church who really nurtured me and really cared for me. And there were a couple of young people who befriended me. I'm still friends with one of them. She lives in Chicago now. And she befriended me, just really loved on me. But I learned about Pine Forge, I learned about Oakwood, and I learned that there was life outside of the projects. And I returned to school, and I aspired to have a greater life. And so that's what I did. I knew that Eric and I did not have to be subjected to just continuing with life as I understood, but there was life outside of my inner city, and that was great. And the church was responsible for giving me that picture.
Amen. Amen. So you happen to be married to Dr.
Yes.
David Sedlacek that we didn't mention. So Dr. Sedlacek, one of the things that you do is to train pastors, and one of the things that we know is that the Bible tells us how to care for children. What does the Bible tell us to do?
Well, the foundation of all care is love. And what does love look like? Is love safe or is love not safe? And certainly wise parenting, their love is for their children is safe. In other words, they will not abuse their children. They see their children and they comfort their children when they're hurt, and they even fight for their children to protect their children from harm. And so that's a very big part of child rearing. There are many people who we've talked to who've never had anyone fight for them. They've either not seen because of their own abuse, or they turn a blind eye because we're not supposed to talk about these kind of things. We should be silent. But that's not what Jesus ever did. Jesus spoke up, for those who were abused. That was a part of his mission statement, to heal the brokenhearted, to set the captives free, to see people who were hurt and to step in and to intervene. And that's our job as well.
That's a true.
I was just going to say that, again, listening to Lynn's story, having read it and then hearing her, this family paid a steep price to fight for their children. They, in spite of the anxiety of losing an entire half of the family, it was a small price to pay to protect their children. And I don't know the ages of the girls now, but I know that that's going to make a huge difference down the road. I know my mom, who just recently passed away, was very adamant, you are going to get an education. And she made me responsible for Eric. I returned to school in the summer. I had Eric in March. I returned to summer school, finished my high school education. I could go to activities at school, but I had to lug Eric along. But when it came time to go to college, I wanted to go to Oakwood. She said, that's too far away, you can't do it. But she was adamant that I needed to go to get an education, and that meant so much to me. Again, she made the sacrifice to care for Eric while I did that. Not nearly as large as what Lynn and her family did, but knowing it really has made a difference in my life to know that my mother wanted that for me. And when Lynn's daughters get old enough, as they're processing the memory of this experience, my mother and father fought for me, and willing to take on a whole family for me. That's going to really settle their hearts in a big way.
One of the things that the Bible teaches also is the principle of Matthew 18, that when someone offends you, you're to go to them and talk to them about it and try to work it out with them. And one of the challenges of that, though, when we have cases of child abuse, is that to go to that person, even if you take the child with you, to talk to that person and share their story with them, that is not the number one, by any means, process that we are to follow. One of the things that we know is that we're to report to the law. We're not to do the investigation ourselves or go and try and figure it out, because that puts us in a very vulnerable position many times. And certainly those who are perpetrators tend to deny, oh, I didn't really mean it, or they minimize it. And so we're not to be the primary investigators. We're to report it to the authorities. They're the ones that are to do the investigation and to come to whatever conclusions need to be arrived at. So that principle is one we need to nuance when we really understand about child abuse and the dynamics of the abuser as opposed to the victim.
Gotcha. Have we reached a moment of reckoning in our church? We're hearing more and more of these cases. Most recently we heard about the pastor who was going to be, funeralized at Oakwood University, but then it's come to light that he had a history of abuse, and there was an uproar. Are we actually past the point now where we need to be informing people? Have we reached a point now whereby people do know that, yes, we cannot do this anymore, we have to speak up? What are your thoughts?
I think we're on a journey, but we haven't arrived. We have, wonderful programs in the church, End It Now and all of that, but we're still on a journey of education. We still hear far too often, whether it's cultural, you protect the family at all costs, and so when something happens, you don't say anything about it. And we've heard story after story of in our church, you don't speak up because this has happened before, and it's happened before, and it's happened even prior to that. So it's just serial abuse happening in a church, but we're not supposed to say anything because we don't want to make the church look bad, we don't want to make our families look bad. And so this culture of silence is something we haven't arrived at having the courage to speak out and to really bring about healing because of that.
Yeah. But that moment is past due. You heard Lynn say 1 out of 3 girls and 1 out of 5 boys. And those numbers only continue to increase.
That's correct.
The generational trauma keeps being handed down. So we're past due.
Yes.
And we are being pushed by survivors who have the bravery of Lynn and her family. And we will, I'm not the pastor, but we will be judged based on what we chose to do, who we chose to stand with.
Absolutely.
And I think that's something that is up and coming. I see signs of hope. I teach here. I love our young people. They are ready to change the world. And so I have hope, but...
Yes.
And I think that it's an accurate depiction. It's a journey. And to your point, Melissa, about educating church members, because church members will say, well, let's not air dirty laundry. let's keep it to ourselves, or let the pastor investigate. That is not the protocol. We are supposed to be people who love the law, and people who love the law will follow the law. And the law is that we are to report it and let the appropriate people manage that. And we also have seen in this recent experience with this pastor that people have complained and also have felt very helpless. You know, what can we do? That's just the way it is. That's just the way the brethren operate. Well, I'm one of those voices, and you know, I've been told by you know, people I love and people who know me, you know, I'm a fighter. I'm not okay with just saying it's just the way it is. That's not all right with me. We don't have to have it be just the way it is. We can be that voice. One person can start a fire. It just takes one person to stand up for the right. And I'm willing, again, I keep referring back to Lynn because I think it's so remarkable that she would be willing to walk away from an entire half of her family. I'm willing to stand up and let you crucify me, crucify my reputation, trash me, and turn your head when you see me, but you'll know where I stand. There won't be a question about who I am or what I'm doing. You'll know. And I know that all of heaven is on my side because it's the right side, you know, being the champion for the vulnerable and speaking up. And it's like slowly turning a battleship, but I think, you know, if there are enough of us who cry out and spare not, it will make a difference.
And I also know that we are being very intentional in the seminary about educating the students in the seminary, the seminarians, about these issues. So we mandate that they go to annual End It Now programs. That's required. We integrate this kind of content into several of our classes, pastoral counseling classes and our marriage and family classes and others as well, where we are making sure that we do everything we can to educate them so that they can be knowledgeable about educating their congregations.
All right, thank you so much for joining us and having this important discussion. And so our next segment, we will go further into End It Now and find out what our church is doing to end sexual abuse. Welcome, ladies. Thank you so much for joining us as we continue the discussion on how to safeguard our children from sexual abuse. So we're joined by Dr. Ann Hamill, who is a psychologist, and she is also part of the missionary care team for the General Conference, and Sherry Corder, who is the co-author of End It Now 2023 initiative, also along with Dr. Ann Hamill. So we'll start with you, Sherry. So the church has a system in place for weeding out abusers. Tell us a little bit about what that's all about.
And this has been going on for many years, and most people are familiar with the screening that Sabbath school teachers and Pathfinder leaders and so forth need to go through in order to be part of those ministries in our churches. And I know sometimes people fuss about the time that it takes, and I just did this 3 years ago and nothing has changed, but I was amazed to learn the number of predators that actually are weeded out through that process. You would think that if you had a background of something regarding abusing children, that you would just not even do it. And I'm sure that's true in many cases, that just having the process in place keeps some people from even trying to be part of it. But there are others, a great number, that actually are discovered and prevented from working with their children.
Okay, so the church is making an effort, and one of the things is through End It Now. For those who may not be familiar with End It Now, tell us a little bit about it.
End It Now is a global initiative to raise awareness and to advocate for stopping violence against women and children and the vulnerable of all ages. The initiative began in 2009 and has spread now to over 200 countries. It's our church's strongest initiative to end violence.
Okay, and so this year the focus is on wolves in sheep clothing in terms of how to make sure that the flock is safe from their leaders. And so one of the cases that you looked at was actually a diary of a young girl, between her and her principal, some of those conversations. And so we'll play a clip from this diary, and you can tell us a little bit more about the project. And
April 23rd, Dear Jesus, our teachers are all so nice. Mr. and Mrs. B share the lower grades, and Mrs. G teaches our home ec class. She teaches me piano, too. Mr. M is the principal, but teaches most of the classes for my grade. His wife teaches the other ones. Mr. M teases me sometimes by stepping on my toes or spanking me with the ping pong paddle when we're a team in foursies, but he's gentle and it's just his way of saying hi. He told me today that he thinks I would make a really good school teacher and that maybe someday we can be teachers together at the same school. Wouldn't that be something? Yesterday was our all-school picnic and my parents did the food. Everyone loved it. I'm so happy with how well my dad gets along with Mr. M and the other teachers too. Maybe they will be a witness to him and he will start going to church. Please help me do well in my Bible test tomorrow. All of those minor prophets are hard to remember. Love, Sarah.
we've heard the clip, and so tell us a little bit how this story came together.
Well, as a psychologist, I've worked with women and men over the years who have experienced childhood sexual abuse. And recently, a woman came to me who had experienced abuse several years, many years before in her life, but was still dealing with the impact of that abuse. Her story was compelling. And so when I was asked to do the End It Now initiative for this year, I invited Sherry to join me, and together we have used this as a case study to illustrate the impact of sexual abuse that will last sometimes for years in the lives of people who have been abused.
So when we were listening to that clip, talk about the psychology of the abuser and the impact this has on the victim.
You know, it's fascinating to try to understand what would lead a person to do something like this. You know, what's the slippery slope that they go down? The title of our initiative is Wolves in Sheep's Clothing. It's about the impact of sexual abuse when it's perpetrated by someone who claims to be a follower of Jesus, particularly the damaging impact when it's someone who is a leader within the church. How does it happen that someone who's committed their lives to proclaiming the gospel could commit such damage, such harm to one of those that they're ministering to? So it's hard to understand the psychology, but it appears that it's something that happens gradually, one step at a time. And as their efforts, their attempts to groom a young girl are successful, they go further and further until it's extremely damaging and it's full-fledged abuse.
Yeah. So there's a package of material that's been put together. Tell us about how it is you're hoping that this information or what you've done will help local congregations.
Okay, traditionally, the End It Now puts together a packet every year, and it's sent out all around the world. And the packet would include a printed sermon that somebody in the church could present. They could adapt it and present it, and then also the material to do a workshop. And I know different things have been done different years, but not always videos. But this year, they asked for a video, and we ended up doing a video of the sermon, which is an overview. It really could be used in a church service. We tried very hard to be careful with our terminology, but somebody could have children's church that day or something. It could be used later, but we like the idea of it being presented during church because then people will be exposed to the material who wouldn't stay for the afternoon. So there's that piece. There's a handout that goes with it that has a list of all kinds of resources on the topic. And then the afternoon piece is the workshop. And that piece is where we've included this case study of Sarah's diary. And that also has a couple of handouts. There's, one handout, but also another resource for the discussion leader, things for them to consider ahead of time to talk about. I don't think Sarah's diary stands alone. It needs discussion and it needs some unpacking. And so we've provided those resources for that to happen.
So you've made it easy for congregations to actually tackle this subject. And when are we hoping that churches will play this information?
End It Now Sabbath is the last Sabbath of August every year. And churches can, go a little before or after depending on what the needs of that congregation are. So I honestly don't know exactly when the general membership could access that information online. The women's ministries leaders will have that. And then I'm sure very soon the general membership would be able to go on and look at that information on enditnow.org.
Okay.
And they should put in 2023 to get to the specific material.
Because every year there's a different focus. Sometimes it could be domestic violence or some other aspect of abuse. And so maybe, Anne, you can talk about this tension between mercy and justice, because it's one of the things we find with the churches in terms of there's that culture of silence, which we heard talked about earlier, whereby we don't want to put our bad, publicity out there. And so there's that need to shelter, our perpetrators. How do we fix this?
Yeah. The story we've portrayed is a true story. It was the diary kept by a 14-year-old girl as the abuse was transpiring over a period of 18 months. And it's so interesting to see how she was groomed and how often this kind of thing happens. Statistics show that between 75 and 91% of abusers are someone the child knows and trusts. That means it's someone that we also know and trust. It's someone within the family or the church or the community that presents themselves well. In the story we've presented, it's Sarah's principal. Now, this man was charismatic. He was very spiritual. Sarah didn't want to tell because even she didn't understand that he deserved punishment. And if she had told, and when she finally did tell as an adult, many people either didn't believe her or believed that the work that he was doing was valuable enough and he was sorry that he shouldn't be punished. And I think most of us struggle with, do you destroy someone's life by reporting them? Or do you just keep quiet and do your best to make it not happen again? We see that so often where people are afraid to tell because of the impact. It splits families, it splits churches. And we don't want the church to look bad to the world. So it's an inner tension that we deal with, that we have to continue to grapple with if we want to protect our children.
One of the examples, we use 7 examples of abuse in the sermon portion. One of them illustrates this point. It was about a young man who was, I won't go into the whole story here, but there was an abuse situation with the advisor at his school. And it turned out that it had been known by the faculty and by other students that this man had a problem, and he had been warned, even in writing, to stop, in his case, taking students to the gym. But it continued, and because people were reluctant, as she's saying, to take that stand, but because of that, this man had more and more and more victims. So that's part of the tension, that we have this person we want to protect, but then what about all the potential victims down the road that we need to protect?
As Christians, we feel like it's our responsibility to focus on forgiveness and mercy, as Christ did. We are to forgive others as we want to be forgiven. But at the same time, we need to recognize that forgiving, extending mercy, does not mean that another person is not held accountable for the wrong that they've done. So I think as a church and as individuals, we need to find a balance between forgiveness and mercy, and continuing to love the perpetrator, and yet at the same time holding them accountable for what they've done, and taking definitive steps to protect women and children and victims of all ages and sexes.
Thank you so much for joining us online. For more information, you can read these stories and more in the August issue of the Lake Union Herald.